you can see, it is raining outside. And unfortunately, the rotors on these lovely devices don't like water. So I kind of made some adjustments, and we have a couple of videos as well. But if it gets better towards the end, I'll peek my head out and see if we can go around the back and fly a bit. All right. Welcome to the future of what drones can do. I shot that on Monday with that little guy. And there was no way, even 5 years ago, that we would have had the gimbal ability on a drone that small to shoot that. It's insane. It was very windy, and I went like almost a mile over the ocean. And it is incredible how much work is being put into these devices. So I thought that was a good opening. But it isn't all just amazing technology. There's a lot of responsibility that comes with it, right? So I've spent the past 4 years in the identity and security world, and this is my hobby. I love flying drones. I love programming with drones, and I thought I would let you all know all of the changes that are happening from a regulatory perspective, but also how much more forward the technology is getting to where it is like a real legitimate industry that can be used outside of just photography. So about 2006 is when the Federal Aviation Agency issued the first commercial drone permit ever in the world. And we kind of played around with it for a little while, and it turns out that they found some applications could be done more inexpensively than with crop duster planes with drones. So around 2011, that's when they gave the first agricultural permits. And of course, I'm sure that you've heard that Amazon's been working on this drone delivery system for a while. It's been 10 years since then. And some things may have gone really far, but this one definitely didn't go very far. But in 2015, a really big game changer moment happened in the National Park and Wildlife Agency, at least in the United States, in a joint effort with Canada, discovered that instead of sending search and rescue teams to risk their lives on really bad terrain, they were going to see if they could find some climbers out on the edge of a cliff, and they used a drone to do it. And that's when it was first introduced as an option for safety. In 2017, there was over 1 million drones registered, and there are plenty that are not. So just imagine that that was as many as the FAA actually knew about. But the first commercial drone delivery service, that was not Amazon. It was actually Wing, and that was just a few years ago in 2019. Oh, here, let me get off of there. There you go. And here we are today. In 2 weeks, on September 16th, RemoteID will go live that as a regulatory compliance for any drone that is flown in the United States. And shortly thereafter, at the end of this year and January 1st of next, the EU will follow. So what does that even mean? Is this all complicated now? I thought I could just buy a drone for Christmas and fly it, you know? What does this mean? Why is this happening? So I wanted to kind of go through what the technicalities were and the reasons for it. Obviously, there have been enormous demand for inspections that, again, will prove less dangerous for the operators that we're inspecting. So right now, there's many applications for inspections. There's also mapping. So this is done for surveying land. This is done for taking a look at an area to see any differences over time. A good example of this is what happens after a devastating fire in a big neighborhood. They want to see like top-down mapping overlays, and that's now done with drones instead of helicopters. And of course, now we actually do have deliveries happening now in rudimentary forms, but only to select markets that really want it. Obviously, this is what it's best known for, is beautiful, breathtaking videos and photography. But also, I have a DJI Avata FPV drone over there, and it is fantastically fun. This is just an entry-level racing drone to give you an immersive experience with a headset, but a lot of these drones are home-built by serious racers who know what they're doing to go through courses, and now photography and racing's kind of meshing. So now major motion picture companies want racing drones to be used for their cinematography because of how exciting the shots can be. But of course, there's other applications for drones that we've seen in various sizes, and some of them, of course, are used at this point in war. But there's a lot of concerns around aviation safety of drones and security. So this is something that the entire United Nations wanted to address, because right now, if you are a pilot in a plane, depending on the aircraft, you probably have a transponder attached to it, which squawks a little bit about you, like your location, your altitude, your tail number, things like that. The same thing happens to most helicopters. But helicopters can go much lower than fixed-wing aircraft on any given moment, just like a drone. The difference is, these drones don't show up on a radar. But I can pull up Flight Radar 24, and I can see the next Airbus coming in to Copenhagen. But I can't see the drone. There are some really advanced scale technology that is very expensive that like prisons can use, the stadiums can use to try to detect certain radio waves that may come from a drone. But there wasn't really one that was universally decided on. So that's where RemoteID comes in. So this is pretty much a license plate that's digital for your drone. And the moment this was introduced, many of the hobbyists in the industry balked at it. They're like, I don't want anybody to know that was my drone over there. And I said, well, if you fly any other kind of aircraft, that's just necessary. They have to know, air traffic control has to know, so that they can reach you and let you know to maybe do an evasive maneuver if there's an emergency, etc. And these are much smaller, but some of the drones are getting larger. And if there is a collision, it can become very dangerous. So RemoteID is a schema. It's basically a data set that a beacon will squawk at a certain interval. And this is what many countries were trying to figure out. Like, what is that? I look at it, what is my JSON payload, basically? What is it going to be? Because that means I can build a mobile app or a website that can at least show me what I have going on in the area. So this is just real-time identification and tracking through broadcast or network connections. There's also like additional things you can add to it. So a lot of these drones are very expensive. The Mini 3 Pro I have here was probably roughly around $600-700 US. The Avata was about $800. But these are the entry-level drones just with DJI, and there are many that are thousands and thousands of euros. So if you have a really good tool and you're using it for surveying or for a video company, you're not going to want to just chuck your drone because it's not RemoteID compatible, right? So this is where aftermarket modules were requested by both the FAA and ESA to make sure that there were at least some third-party options before the compliance rules went in place. So that's what these other solutions are. Inside of the message that is sent out, you have to have key data, like your drone ID, and that could be your serial number, or what is being proposed right now is possibly like a session ID. So instead of it just being the same one, it could be the current session, which means if there is a session ID in the future, maybe that could be a session ID that is granted permission for a while, and it has like a way to expire that session as well. Altitude, speed, and control station ID. We'll talk about that in a minute. So basically, this really enhances the safety and security. As a drone operator, for me, I feel like it's a pretty safe device. I have run that thing into trees, this particular one, run it into trees. I have had to grab it out of the air and directly impacted, like very little of anything on my hand when I grabbed it. This is not really a threat because this particular drone, not the Avata, but the Mini 3, is under 249 grams. So it's considered an ultra lightweight drone, and it's considered a little bit less likely to cause true harm. But the bigger you go, the harder they fall, right? And that is the reason why this is a big deal. Even just, I believe, a few days ago, there was probably an impact to a large aircraft that happened right outside Charles de Gaulle, and they're still looking into what it was. It doesn't mean that it was done on purpose. Sometimes a transmission is just severed from your drone to the controller, and it just keeps going in a direction, or it tries to return to its home point. And it's not going to look out and see that there are other aircraft in the area. So these are always just accidents. And while they are rare, they still happen, and we want to keep the skies as safe as possible. Pilots go through so much training. Engineers go through so many iterations of the larger manned aircraft. They just wanted some way to kind of remove any boulders in their path, and that's why they introduced this. But now it got to the point where it became law, and it is a federal law, at least now in the US, that you're going to have RemoteID transmitting from your drone by September 16th of 2023. This is the best picture I could find. I was hoping to just show you in real time outside, but again, the rain doesn't really want to play my friend. So if you have an interest in finding out if there were drones around you, right now you can't really see anything because nothing was required. But later on this year and into next, you're going to see that change very rapidly. So this is kind of the flow that you could expect, but it's only one flow of 3 possible ones. The idea is that because it is publicly squawking this information, I use the term squawk because that's what the rest of aviation likes to call it. The only issue here is that there is no authentication mechanism around any of this data. So it will just broadcast all of it to anybody who has a receiver that can see it. That means if somebody is unhappy with your flight path, they can also find out not only where it is, where it's been, but where you are, because there is going to be a link to exactly where the control station is. This guy. And who's holding the control station? You. If you want to understand in a really basic way This is an excellent website, regardless of where you live in the world, explaining the differences in how they're going to transmit this information and the requirements around it. Now, this is not the actual manufacturers. This is just what each of these regulatory bodies demand. And I'll show you the differences here in a minute, but this is a great site if you're interested to do more. So, some of the applications that could help would definitely be surveilling drones with the camera. So right now, it's difficult to discern who breached an area that they shouldn't be in. I'm specifically thinking about military zones, airports, medical helicopter pads, things like that, or even school zones where people have no business flying and they don't know why there's a drone there. Right now, there is no way to tell who that is. But this would stop that so that they could at least check to see which drones are authorized or not. They could even have a preloaded list of serial numbers that were allowed in the area. And obviously, air traffic control cares a lot about this issue, right? Because there have been several times where pilots have had to deviate from their directed path by the air traffic controller because they did see a large drone, probably like a media-sized one that would be used to, I don't know, film like a big football game, something like that, and it wasn't paying attention to where it was, so they've had to deviate off of a flight path, and air traffic control is busy enough with trying to coordinate other aircraft. They had no way of knowing where that is. So this helps them tremendously at least know where that is. And this makes it actually possible to tell a specific drone where to go. And it isn't just something that you would keep by yourself. You could also have it be a larger system that many people buy into, kind of like the way GPS works today. It could be a larger system that many different manufacturers use. This is a big one. The Mini 3 Pro that I have here is very quiet. I don't know if you've ever heard a big drone. Have you heard a big drone go off before? It is very loud. It is a huge influx of wind. In comparison, this is pretty quiet. And once it's roughly about maybe 20 meters off the ground, you can't really hear it. So it's very innocuous, and it tends to not bother wildlife, birds, and any of the other animals, so it's really good for inspecting where are herds moving and stuff like that. The difference is if one of these goes missing and somebody finds it, it's very difficult to identify whose it was. And so RemoteID will also allow that if a drone goes missing in the wilderness and it's found. Lots of infrastructure for bridges is also another one. Think about the zoning that maybe you get to unlock and the people know that you are allowed to be there. Hey, this serial number belongs to a well-known pilot that is always inspecting bridges. They're totally fine. You can start making your own allow and deny lists from this as well, meaning that if somebody is persistently going after school to fly over London Bridge, they can be like, oh, it's that kid again. We should probably go talk to their parents. And you know a repeat offender, right? And of course, search and rescue I touched on just a little bit earlier. But there are some huge challenges in this implementation, even though they're bought in. Like, the UN is bought into this, but it is very difficult to take an entire industry, pick it up and say, you're doing this now, and have there be no fallout. There's huge privacy issues with this, and I'll tell you why. Right now, if I were to be in a manned aircraft, what happens when I'm in the plane and somebody can see on Flight Radar 24 that it's going somewhere? I go with it. It's not like somebody can really stop me mid-air. Like, if they really wanted to, I guess, maybe they could. But they can't just come up to me because my plane or my helicopter is in motion. But that is not the case with a drone pilot. Specifically thinking about the FPV pilot who has goggles on, cannot see around them, and will have people approach mid-flight when they're doing things. And the only reason that they could do that is because they can just take an app, see which drones are in the area, say, oh, there's that drone, I don't like it here, where's the controller? And it shows the location of the person holding it. this kind of privacy has never really been an issue in aviation before because, again, the pilot went with the aircraft, and this time we are separate from it. So now there is a lot of concern about that, hence the session ID idea, right? And the other one would be there's a possibility that maybe we lock this down to just law enforcement being able to see it, or air traffic control. But right now, there is nothing from a regulatory standard across all these countries that agree. So there isn't anything at the moment. And yet, it still has to be in place for compliance. So how do you deal with that? Well, there are definitely some people online that will say, this is how you jam a signal. This is how you do, wrap your whole drone in tinfoil and block this. But what you're doing is you're falling out of compliance, which means if a law enforcement officer detects that or sees that, that is a very big deal. It doesn't matter which country you're in. This is a safety issue now that you're interfering with. So at the moment, in order to fly, this has to be turned on. There's also some technical complexities to this. I think I mentioned before that nobody really agreed about how the data should be transmitted. Oops, no software update for you. Okay. There are varied drone platforms. DJI is just the most popular one right now. There's Autel, there's Parrot, there's several that are spinning off in different countries. And this is just them trying to decide how do they stay in compliance with transmitting their ID in the best way possible for their drone. So there are different rules for different countries. But how do you sell a drone that someone's going to buy in Germany and then use in Asia? That's difficult, right? So there are some technical complexities because some countries think it's totally fine to use a cellular network. Others say that it's not fine. You have to use Bluetooth. And the rules just differ so much that collaboration needs to happen on a much more global scale. And that did happen in the aviation industry. So I've mentioned the FAA and ESA, but of course we have the International Transit Authority as well. That is what everybody uses when they cross borders. These are the same rules that everybody gets to have. There are subsets once you're in that country, but in general, there are some things that are agreed upon. We do not currently have a global body that regulates drones, but I do think that's probably going to need to happen. And just simply put, if those people who don't want to comply, they just won't. So they're not going to buy a module that costs them 90 euros to put on their drone. They're just not going to do it and see how long they can get away with it, especially if they're a bad actor. Or they may plug their drone in and run a Python script and turn off the ability for RemoteID to be transmitted in the first place. So how effective is this then? It seems like only the people who are law-abiding that are willing to comply are the ones broadcasting their data. So it has been loose historically for enforcement, so it'll need some refinement as time goes on. But regardless, we have it now, and I do think that the pros outweigh the cons just purely from a safety perspective, because this way makes it possible for drones to show up on an overlay for radar for anybody who's just trying to navigate the sky. So we get some enhanced situational awareness. Maybe we'll prevent some mid-air collisions this time. It really does help aid your incident response. If there's some information already about your drone and something happens and you're not there, at least it will be squawking that information. And of course, this allows you to really coexist with manned aircraft. So currently, at least for the next couple of weeks, there is a height ceiling for drones. You cannot fly above 400 feet above ground level in the States, and I think it's about 120 meters in the EU. But that's because they're trying to separate the manned aircraft. But as we've mentioned, helicopters defy all those odds, right? They fly real low, they go in between buildings just like we do. So it really isn't safe for helicopter pilots. And it's even less safe for small planes like Cessnas and Cirrus, because they often can't really change a whole lot of their trajectory, and they will often just stay low because they're used to train pilots in the beginning when the pilots are new to learning how to steer the aircraft. So they're also kind of sometimes invading that space as they come into land. So this allows coexistence, probably actually at higher levels as well, which will allow other things like deliveries to take place where you can actually clear a radio tower and not run into it. So this is why I think it is a good thing. And I know it's tough. I don't work for any of these regulatory bodies. I am just an avid fan of flying. But at the end of the day, I often wondered how in the world I could know if an aircraft was approaching while I was flying. And I think in the future, we can have software updates to our controllers that will show us that. And that will show vice versa. They'll be able to see that I'm flying and avoid a collision. I think once that happens, it'll become a lot safer. The aviation industry is known for redundancy and safety. Even though we hear it's news, right, about a plane crash, it's news because it's not normal. It doesn't happen every day. People crash their cars every day, all the time. So it's a very safe industry at large if you look statistically, and it's only that way because they have to look at how do we prevent this from happening again. And after the first several major manned aircraft incidents, they said, okay, we have to know where you are and you have to know where we are.
Not too long ago, flying drones and other unmanned aircraft seemed like something out of science fiction. But now, the future has arrived, and the number of drones, or unmanned aircraft systems, is steadily increasing each year. The FAA is committed to fully integrating UAS into our national airspace system. Remote identification of drones is a crucial component of these integration efforts. In short, remote ID is the ability of drones in flight to provide identification and location information that can be received by other parties. See how remote ID is helping to pave the way of the future and welcome the benefits these new entrants can bring. Due to advances in technology, more and more unmanned aircraft systems are taking to the skies, proving beneficial for aerial imaging, inspection, delivery, and other capabilities. Moving forward, we want to be certain these unmanned aircraft are flying safely and within areas they are allowed to operate. Remote ID will provide information about drones while in flight, allowing authorized individuals to ensure the safety of our skies. And it lays the foundation needed to welcome more complex drone operations in the future. Here's how it works. In its most basic form, Remote ID can be described as a digital license plate for UAS. To comply with Remote ID requirements, a UAS must broadcast message elements from takeoff to shutdown, such as the unique ID number, location, and altitude of the drone, and its control station or takeoff location. If it appears to be flying in an unsafe manner or in an area they are not allowed to operate, authorized individuals from public safety organizations may request more information about the drone from the FAA. Remote ID is a publicly available broadcast from a UAS that can be received through applications for concerned members of the general public. Those authorized to request additional information may include aviation safety inspectors, law enforcement, and air traffic security specialists. Just as every driver on the road has a license plate, most drone pilots will be required to comply with the Remote ID rule by fall 2023. Safety and security are top priorities for the FAA, and remote identification of UAS is an essential building block toward the evolution of UAS operations. The future is here, and with Remote ID, we look forward to seeing it take flight.
A little dramatic, but you get the idea. It's probably the shortest video that I could find on this topic from the FAA. And so here's the difference between the two. In order to be somebody that flies with certain permissions at night, or in an area where you need to unlock it, like very close to an airport. Let's say your backyard is right up against the airport. You're not going to be able to fly your drone from your own backyard without permission. And so that requires you to take an extensive pilot test. So in the States, it's called Part 107. And it includes being able to read aeronautical charts, wind, all of it, just like a pilot in a plane would. You also have it here in Denmark, and it's also pretty extensive. I think Droner does it here in Copenhagen, and they are a little bit different, but not too much. How you fly is how you fly. Where you can fly is up to the country. So I mentioned there's two different types right now of ways it can broadcast. In network ID, it could be like Bluetooth Wi-Fi, or it could be cellular network. And again, it's going to become mandatory for you to do cellular network transmission in the EU. These are the kinds of aftermarket devices that you can see. I would have to strap it basically on the top of the drone and go from there. The cheapest one I see again right now is roughly about 90 euros, but they are working to get it cheaper, and that's mostly because you'd have a larger drone you want to add it to. This is pretty much your payload. This is your JSON, right, that you're going to get from the drone. I used to do some work with beacons. I found it really fascinating to write software with them. It's very basic. This is all the stuff you would get. This particular screenshot is of drone scanner, and Open Drone ID OSM is the one on the right. This one actually showed part of the trail and the path of the drone and shows where the observer is and then where you are, perhaps, as the one holding the controller. Drone Scanner has a little bit less data than Open Drone ID. Both of these are GitHub projects. Highly recommend you check out and see how they plugged it in. One of them was done with Flutter. The other two were native Android and iOS apps done with, I believe, Java and Objective-C. I don't think they moved into Swift yet. But it is really interesting to see what is sent. It's not too different than what you would see on Flight Radar. Obviously, some of this information could be hidden. So we might see a future where if you are a software engineer and you are putting this in the App Store, the FAA and ESA might tap you on the shoulder and say, maybe don't show where the controller is, because this is just for the general public to look at. But right now, there is no such demand for that. But Drone Scanner on their own decided to, Open Drone ID decided to omit the location of the controller and just show the drone. So this is, there are ways you can ethically do this while we're waiting for regulatory approval. Kitty Hawk is another one. I think right now it's called Aloft. This is a good chart to kind of show you, if you have good cell networks, which you do here because you don't have a whole lot of mountains right around you, so you probably have really strong signal, then maybe you could have like a standard RID. But if you only have like certain kinds of networks, then you have to qualify for limited, and it depends on how the area is and the power that's on board, like your motherboard and your Wi-Fi transmitter on the drone. So now you can imagine how expensive this is for drone manufacturers to suddenly have to put this in, because it was talked about, but it never passed until last year. So last year it did pass in both the EU and in the US, and so they gave them a year to update all their new drones coming out after, I believe it was October of 2022. All of those drones had to have remote ID enabled by default so that people wouldn't have to buy a module for them. Because DJI does a very similar process to Tesla's, they do over-the-air updates for these all the time. So even though FPVs are largely not currently compliant because most of them are home-built, the Avata was able to have an over-the-air update. So both of these devices are remote ID ready, but it's not turned on until the day that it is supposed to be turned on. Right, talked about that. And so yeah, pretty much the biggest challenges remain for hobbyist adoption. If you buy a drone and you don't know that it's an older drone or it's one that isn't turned on, how do you know where you can fly it? If your drone does not transmit a remote ID, there is a place for you to learn to fly. And they're called FRIAs. So these are federal aviation approved flight areas, kind of like your hobbyist school area might do this, like a club of fixed wing or rotor-based aircraft might say, hey, this is an area around a park, we want to be able to do this, and it's inspected by an FAA person, and they say, you're good to go. So you can take toy drones, you can take home builds that you're doing yourself without having to have that transmitted. You can just play around and learn how to fly. So those are in most major cities right now, and then you can apply to add an area, maybe like your backyard, I suppose. So if you're interested to learn more about this is probably the more interesting link for all of you. There's an extensive amount of FAQ on ESA's site. I think they actually did a much better job informing drone pilots about what to do and how to think about the problem. They also are much more realistic about connectivity because we don't have great Wi-Fi everywhere. We don't have great cellular networks everywhere, especially if you went to Switzerland on vacation. So they're realistic about as long as you had a connection at some point, you're allowed to take off. If you lose connection, you're not in trouble. It just happens, and we understand. You just need to try to land it as soon as you can, or just submit a pre-approval for an area you want to fly. So now that you know what the stakes are, let's talk about the more fun stuff to wrap this up. Right now, there's already, I actually got to ride in one. There is an autonomous air taxi that is considered a drone, because a drone is just a flying computer, right? And that's what it is. It is a big flying computer with room for an adult to be in it. It's pretty cool. And the idea was to get people who are in a rush in a really congested area, like to their airport in time or to something in time. And helicopters are not really very environmentally friendly to go just short hops, and so they were trying to see if they could do like a big drone that could handle the weight of a human being. And it was very cool to see the kinds of things that are coming out, and it looks like now they're funded, and we're probably going to see at least a couple of rollouts by 2025. Right, so there's a concept as a pilot called visual line of sight. Have you heard of this? No? Cool. Well, it's pretty much what it says it is, right? Is that if I fly a drone and I can't see it anymore, it's beyond visual line of sight. That's what they're trying to get to, because it's really difficult to deliver things far away to someone in the country autonomously if you can no longer see the drone, right? So currently, you're not allowed to do that unless you have special approval as like a Part 107 pilot. But we think by 2030 that there will be an easy way to automate this to be beyond line of sight. We're actually already seeing drone swarms right now. Instead of fireworks, I understand that like several cities are doing drone light shows. Very cool. But now they'll see if they could do something a little bit more effective, like light up an entire area that is dark and scramble really quickly. Try to follow multiple fugitives, or try to find multiple people that are lost in the woods, and have it be a coordinated effort where they don't run into each other. It's not just one drone flying with a person, it is a coordinated effort. And there's already specs coming out for that, and it is very exciting. We're already surveying large areas of land with no CO2 emissions at all, and that personally makes me really happy, and mapping out new places to do wind farms. Are you familiar with the concept of digital twins? Yes? This is pretty much the main way that Google Maps is re-imaging. It isn't just going to be satellite data, because once you zoom in, satellite has a quality loss. So they'll fly drones over to do some of that work, so that when you get really close, when you're doing the terrain view in Google Maps, it's actually mapped from a drone. that has flown over that can see a little bit more detail and get a little bit more accuracy. It's very cool. That means you can do a lot of real life 3D and simulations. This is actually also being fed into like flight simulator programs for pilots that fly big airplanes too. And of course, it's just really cost effective. LiDAR is also coming to drones. They become more affordable and more accurate and easier, because remember, every single tiny bit of weight will matter on your drone to how it flies. So if they're going to add something, it needs to be really good. And there's already a whole lot more that is coming so that it could do autonomous flight and self-guided. But this one's the coolest one.
Over the last 7 years, we've expanded dramatically, and we now operate in 8 countries. We serve 3,400 hospitals and health facilities globally, and we'll be serving 10,000 by the end of this year.
I love that there's a catapult.
The aircraft is a vertical takeoff and landing hybrid, and then we use something called a droid that enables us to silently and very, very gently place packages at 99% of homes with dinner plate level accuracy. So that means we can deliver onto your front doorstep, onto table in your backyard.
So this is the droid that comes down from the zip. So if you have a larger space to deliver to and 50 miles away, platform 1 is going to be the right way to do that. Platform 2 is going to be the right way to make deliveries in denser settings. And then it's as simple as wrapping up the package like they would normally for any delivery, whether that's a lab medical test, a home delivery of prescription, a food delivery to someone's home, loading it into the droid through the loading portal, closing it, scanning both, and then sending it off to be delivered to the customer.
We can typically guarantee, it's 7 times faster than an instant delivery via a traditional service you might buy from today, whether you're ordering food or ordering something online. It's much faster, it's zero emission, and it's way more reliable. The reality is, the vast majority of packages, on the order of 80-85% of packages in e-commerce, are 5 pounds or less. Isn't philanthropy, it's about sustainable business models we can actually use to expand access both to healthcare as well as a variety of other economic opportunities to people on Earth who have typically been ignored by logistics networks or by technology companies in general.
Yes, so lots of things are actually already here. I got to see one of those being delivered to a friend of mine in Arkansas, and I was like, what is that? She's like, it's my medication. I was like, they're doing that now? Here? I thought they were doing that in Rwanda. She's like, they got one here too. And I actually saw it happen, and it was so quiet. It was really surprising. It just got in, got out of the way, was very unobtrusive. You can actually schedule times for it to happen. Obviously, there is a difference in cost and need. I love the original zipline catapult style that was done so that it would cut off the amount of battery time that would be needed just to just initially get going. So the inertia would already be there, and then it just needed to kind of maintain, and then it would land and drop. And it was one way. It would just land and drop, like land on a lawn, and then they were able to get it in very rural areas with no streets. And that's so cool that they did that they were able to like iterate and do more and more. So yeah, now that those things are happening, remote ID is really important for that too, because how do you know if this drone is just somebody looking in your window or if it's somebody delivering medication to your neighbor, you know? So this is probably also how we're going to be able to classify what drones are being used for what purpose and if they're allowed to be there. So all really good things are happening because now we can track them. Because before it was just a free-for-all, but now we can track them and make it safer. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I was really hoping I could have shown you in real time an example of remote ID, but I'm sure you have a good imagination, and you can always ping me later if you want. If it stops raining later on tonight, I'll go around the back here, and if you'd like to give it a go, you're welcome to fly in and around the complex here. Thank you.